sir. Sir, good evening, everyone. So, I am presenting an article on apixaban for the treatment of venous thromboembolism associated with cancer. It's published on NEJM on March 29, 2020. This was a multinational randomized investigator-initiated open-label trial with a non-inferiority trial with a blinded central outcome. They assigned patients with active cancer or with a history of cancer with an apixaban or dalteparin. They divided the patients into two groups. So one group will have to receive apixaban and the other was receiving dalteparin. The selected two groups. One group had contained 576 patients and the other group consists of 579 patients. So in apixaban group, apixaban was given at a dose of 10 mg twice daily for first 7 days and followed by 5 mg twice daily for 6 months. After that, in the second group, dalteparin was given subcutaneously at a dose of 200 international units per kg once daily for the first month and 150 international units per kilogram once daily for the rest of the 5 months. And the primary outcome was considered to be the recurrent venous thromboembolism during the trial period. The result of the study was a recurrent venous thromboembolism. The result of the study was among the apixaban group, that is among the 576 patients, 32 patients had recurrent venous thromboembolism, that is 5.6% patients had that. In the dalteparin group, that is among the 579 patients, 46 patients, that is 7.9% had a recurrent venous thromboembolism. Yes, sir?
दोनों दी colleague है देखो इंग्लिश बोलते हैं कितना होल्ड है
Sorry, sir?
Sir, do you want to ask something, sir? Sir, do you want to say something? Okay, Harsha, continue.
Yes, sir. So this study had shown a p-value of less than 0.001 and the major side effect, that is a major adverse effect which affected due to this drug was bleeding. Among the apixaban group, 22 patients had a bleeding episode, and among the dalteparin group, 23 patients had that. So the outcome was it was a non-inferiority trial, and so oral apixaban was considered non-inferior to the subcutaneous dalteparin.
So can you say why this is an open label trial?
That I don't know, sir. They because various trials was performed regarding vitamin K antagonist and then oral anticoagulants, but there was no. Okay. And the yes, sir. Hello.
I can't hear anything on this side.
So your voice is not coming clear, sir. Sir, I think your voice is not coming through clearly, sir.
There's some communication issue, I think, with the network.
Sir?
Sir, do you have a hands-free which you can put in a hands-free connection? Okay, let's move on. Harsha, carry on.
So that was a trial, sir. The name of the study was.
No, Dr. Lavate asked you a question. So
why is it an open label trial?
Because the information from the participants was welcomed. The information was, the result of the study was gathered from the participants only.
You see, the routes are very different, no? One is an oral and one is injectable.
Yes, sir.
So people know what they are taking. If it was both oral, if it was 4 groups with the apixaban placebo and dalteparin with an injectable placebo, then it would have been a crossword double bind. So these routes are only different. So you can't have a double blind unless you add 2 more groups to it. And what are you trying to look at in this trial?
Sir, it has shown that the apixaban is better than dalteparin.
I can
What's the
see
aim behind
article.
doing? What's the aim behind doing this trial?
So that the patient can rely on the oral tablets, because dalteparin is an injectable. It will be difficult for the patient also to take it.
True, but
In
there are
cancer,
already studies which have looked at rivaroxaban and the other dabigatran in this indication.
yes, sir. In comparing to rivaroxaban, apixaban is better than rivaroxaban because with the recurrence of venous thromboembolism with rivaroxaban is more comparing to apixaban. They have shown that there was a study in Lancet which was published in 2018. So they have shown apixaban is better than rivaroxaban.
We welcome Mrs. Devte also. I'm glad to see her in the.
What's the difference in Axaban?
Yes, sir?
What's the difference in action between dabigatran and apixaban?
Dabigatran is a low molecular weight heparin, sir. So,
Dabigatran is a low molecular weight
sorry.
heparin.
Dabigatran is a thrombin inhibitor.
Factor 2 inhibitor. And apixaban?
Apixaban is a 10A inhibitor. Factor 10A inhibitor.
And where does dalteparin
Dalteparin is a like
dalteparin?
It's a enoxaparin like only. It's a low molecular weight heparin. But in here they have taken only cancer patients who are having active or acute cancer incidence or with a history of cancer, because in those patients the chances of
So what is the sign called as when you get thrombosis in a cancer patient, venous thrombosis? What is a sign called as, physical sign called as? What is the name of the person who has named it?
I don't know, sir.
So what is Trocheau's sign?
Trocheau's sign is that that is Trocheau's note. If there is any abdominal malignancy, the right supraclavicular nodes will be palpable. That is
No. That is Virchow's node. Trocheau's sign is where you get venous thrombosis in a patient with cancer. So this to some extent applies to that group of patients.
okay, sir.
I think we have Dr. Mrs. Devte today, so we can ask her if she wants to have any questions. The videos are coming frame by frame, I think. They are coming frame by frame. Sanjay?
Hello? Hello, can you see me or hear me?
Yes,
sir.
very clearly.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Now it
who
is
is
very
the next
clear.
speaker? Who is the next person talking?
Sir, Akshita. Akshita, she will, sir.
Yes, sir.
Hello, which student is going to speak now?
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Can you hear me, sir? My article is basically the Victoria trial. This was published in NAGM in the 2020 article. It's basically it's a multi-center randomized trial on the efficacy and safety.
Are you sure this is an NEJM trial?
Yes, sir. It was published in NAGM.
Because the print looks very different from NEJM.
Oh, just a minute. I'll show you.
This print is not from
It's in
NEJM.
NEJM, so.
NEJM has a different print actually. And you don't have a cross mark on those articles.
This NEJM is also published in the NEJM, and the article from where I am reading it is basically from the JCC article, the Journal of American Economy.
That's what I said. This has to be from a different. Yeah, this is from JACC.
This is from JACC, but this trial is also published in the NEJM.
Currently,
Basically,
the one which you are showing is the JACC.
Yes, sir. The one from where I'm this thing is the JACC heart failure trial. Heart failure journal. Hello. It's the Victoria trial, basically.
This is from NEJM.
This
Second one. This is JACC.
Yes,
the other one is NEJM. True.
NEJM.
Correct. Yeah.
So the Victoria study basically means a very SIGWAT global study in subjects with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. Vericiguat is basically a guanylate cyclase stimulator, which is given as a optimized for a once daily dosage for chronic heart failure patients. Basically, cyclic GMP has its vasodilatory properties along with antifibrotic effects. It improves myocardial remodeling and causes diastolic relaxation and absence of any hemodynamic side effects. Nitric oxide is basically generated in the endothelial cells, and it diffuses to the neighboring cells and stimulates guanylyl cyclase to generate cyclic GMP. And this cyclic GMP has a good effect, or it's basically is essential for the normal cardiac and the vascular functioning. In case of an endothelial injury due to oxidative stress and inflammation, the nitric oxide production decreases, due to which cyclic GMP deficiency occurs and leads to myocardial dysfunction and vascular dysfunction. We use Vericiguat, which is a direct SGC, guanylyl cyclase stimulator, and it also enhances the sensitivity of guanylyl cyclase to nitric oxide, thereby increasing cyclic GMP. So we had a phase 2 trial a phase 2B trial for the Vericiguat, which was a Socrates reduced trial, which mainly tried to see the dosage, adequate dose for Vericiguat. And then we have the Victoria trial, which was done, whose primary objective was to determine whether Vericiguat was superior to placebo on a background of a standard of care. The primary endpoint was to see whether there was an increase in the time to the first occurrence of the composite endpoint of cardiovascular death, and the secondary objective was to see whether Vericiguat is again superior to placebo in increasing the time to cardiovascular death, or the time to the first heart failure hospitalization, and time to all-cause mortality. So this was a randomized placebo-controlled multi-center double-blinded trial where they have taken 4,872 subjects. They were randomized in 1:1 ratio, and as it's shown here, the patients were started. They were randomized in 1:1 ratio, and they were started on a dose of 2.5 mg of Vericiguat for first 2 weeks, then up-titrated to 5 mg of Vericiguat for the next 2 weeks, and then up-titrated to 10 mg for the next 12 weeks. And at the end of 16 weeks, at the end of 4 weeks, they checked for the cardiovascular mortality. And this up-titration, 4-week up-titration phase is done depending upon the inclusion criteria. Mainly included patients with ejection fraction of less than 45%, reduced ejection fraction. NT-proBNP levels of more than 1,000 and BNP levels of more than 300 in patients in sinus rhythm, and NT-proBNP levels of more than 1,600 and BNP levels of more than 500 in patients for those in atrial fibrillation. and patients who have had a prior heart failure hospitalization within a period of 6 months, or who have been needed to give an IV diuretic therapy on an OPD basis, basically worsening of heart failure. So this trial was done, and they excluded people who were clinically unstable with the SBP of less than 100, or who are already on a concurrent use of SGC stimulators, PDE5 inhibitors, or who were receiving any IV ionotropes. So it basically concluded that vericiguat was superior to using of. So basically concluded that the incidence of death from all cardiovascular causes of hospitalization for heart failure was lower among those who received vericiguat than for those among who received placebo alone.
But patients were on normal routine treatment also or no?
Yes, they were all normal routine treatment along with vericiguat and placebo.
Is this available in India?
Yes, sir.
It's available.
I don't know the brand. I'll just check, sir. Not sure.
Okay, fine. That's one. Anybody else has got something?
Next one. Who will present next one? Angela.
I'm going to mute everybody. Only the speaker, I'll keep him unmuted. And whoever wants to speak, please unmute yourself.
Angela or Tarun.
Angela, can you unmute yourself?
So if you look
Angela, are you there?
If Angela is not the next person,
Go ahead. I think Angela is loading the presentation, sir.
Sir,
yeah,
can you hear me?
I
Yeah,
can hear you.
very well.
You know, you tell us about this, about the whole trial. You don't have to read the whole thing from the book.
Yes, sir. My trial is of satralizumab in NMO spectrum of disorder. To begin with, NMO means that the patient is affected and so these are the autoantibody in aquaporin channel 4, which is present in the astrocyte membranes of the central nervous system, which is present in the blood-brain barrier. So when the autoantibodies act upon these astrocytes, they get stimulated and they get stimulated, and complement cascade opens up. And these complement cascade causes the integrins to act, and the interleukin-6 level increases in the blood and the CSF of these patients. So in neuromyelitis optica is basically a disease wherein these patients' own autoantibodies are stimulated and they attack our central nervous system, and it gives rise to
Gives rise to a demyelinating disease. Just proceed with the trial.
Angela, go ahead with the trial.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Hello.
I think
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
I'm so sorry, sir. It's not working properly.
Okay, just speak. Forget the thing. You just speak.
That's what I'm saying. Just
So
speak
in
what you have
neuromyelitis
heard.
optica, interleukin-6 level will increase in these patients. So my trial is on the monoclonal antibody, where satralizumab acts on these interleukin-6. So again, so the symptoms will reduce. So technically speaking, usually what happens is that in the neuromyelitis optica does not have a proper protocol of medications. We usually use those medications which we use in multiple sclerosis, but it has not been very effective. The ones being azathioprine and mycophenolate mofetil and glucocorticoids, but then they have not been very well equipped to prevent relapses. So satralizumab was tried, which is an interleukin-6 inhibitor, a monoclonal antibody against interleukin-6, so that all these symptoms would reduce. So in the trial, they used a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, where they included both those patients who are having autoantibodies IgG against the aquaporin 4 channel, as well as those patients who are seronegative for these antibodies. And they found that the patients who were IgG autoantibody aquaporin 4 channel positive antibodies, they were more, if we start satralizumab in these patients, they responded well with fewer relapses. So in these patients, satralizumab subcutaneously was given at 0, 2, and 4 weeks, and every 4 weeks thereafter of a dose of 120 mg. So along with satralizumab, they also continued the baseline doses of azathioprine and mycophenolate mofetil, and as well as glucocorticoids. So when they found out, when they continued the actual regimen which the patients were taking of all these immunosuppressants, and they added satralizumab subcutaneously, the relapses were very few. So usually what happens in NMO is that the patients come with acute optic neuritis, myelitis, and these patients have brain stem syndromes, cerebral syndromes, and these relapses are very severe, and the deformity usually accumulates over a period of time, which completely crippling the patients. But according to the trials, at the end of the trial, the relapses were very few in those patients who had satralizumab. But then still, this trial was of only 83 patients, so it needs further.
How many years were these?
Further correspondence and further trials need to be there so that we can confirm their
Angela,
effectiveness.
Angela, wait,
amongst the
Angela.
Patients, they did better. But again, they did only those patients who had aquaporin 4 autoantibodies, IgG positive ones. They did much more better than the seronegative ones.
Angela, now, how long was the trial? Can you hear
I
me?
don't think you can.
Yes, sir. Hello.
How long was the trial?
The trial was for 1 year, sir.
1 year. And in 1 year, how many relapses in the routine group and how many relapses in the normal group, in the trial group?
Sir, in the routine group, there was 11% relapses with seropositive patients, sir. and 43% with placebo group, sir.
Placebo means original group, original treatment.
Yes, original treatment of azathioprine and MMF and glucocorticoids.
Yeah, all right. So 1 year, in 1 year, 43% relapse.
Yes, sir.
And in the treated group,
In treated group, only 11%, sir.
11.
Yes, sir.
And 83 patients total.
83 patients, yes, sir.
Fine. So 83 patients treated. And when you add this satralizumab, only 11% relapsed. And when there was no satralizumab, 43% relapsed. And P is
50%
significant.
relapse. That's it, sir. Yes, sir.
Fine. Fine. Next trial, next patient, next person.
Who's the next one to present?
Yes, sir. Me, I'm Dr. Tarun sir from Pune Hospital.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes,
Share your screen with us.
yes, sir. Is it visible, sir, on the screen?
No, your screen is not
No.
visible as yet. Just go at the bottom of the screen and you see share content or share screen.
Is it
now
visible,
it's
sir?
visible. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, today I'm going to present an article which is yet to be published in European Journal of Gastroenterology. It is about the influence of esophageal variceal bleeding on iron status in chronic hepatitis C patients. And
Esophageal bleeding. Yeah, okay.
So the study, this is a type of case control study. The main objectives of this study are to determine the reticulocyte hemoglobin and serum hepcidin levels in anemic chronic hepatitis C patients, and evaluating their influence of these in variceal bleeding and on the iron status of these patients. So this study is usually conducted among a population of 65 persons who are early treatment naive CHC patients. And the study, the groups are divided as anemic non-bleeders, anemic bleeders, and non-anemic patients, each of which consists of 23, 22, and 20 respectively. And there are also a group of 20 healthy volunteers who are age, gender, and socioeconomic status matched. And the exclusions are patients of steatohepatitis and patients with hepatitis B infection, hepatitis B and hepatitis C co-infection, presence of malignancies or chronic inflammatory conditions, or previous history of RBC transfusion in the last 4 months, and who are pregnant women and B12 and folic acid deficiencies. And also child C group cirrhosis patients are also excluded. So the results of the study are the two groups, that is anemic patients and non-anemic patients, the reticulocyte hemoglobin showed a positive correlation with MCV value, where the R value is 0.39 and for MCH's R value is 0.55. And the serum hepcidin values are lower compared to the healthy control groups in all the study groups.
So what is this hepcidin?
So hepcidin is a substance that is produced by the liver that helps in iron regulation in the body, sir. So it usually acts on the ferroportin channel on the enterocytes, and then this helps in the absorption of iron from the intestine. So there were previous studies that said that in chronic hepatitis C patients, the hepcidin values will be low. And usually, because any patients with variceal bleeding, we tend to correct it. The anemic status should also be evaluated. But sometimes what happens is, because in these patients the hepcidin is low, the conventional parameters cannot be used in these patients. So in this study, they are trying to see whether any other parameters like hepcidin and reticulocyte hemoglobin can be used. And in this study group, these
Index of the anemia.
Sir?
As an index for the anemia.
As an index for iron deficiency, sir.
Yeah. Okay. But ferritin and all was tried?
Yes, sir. Ferritin were also seen. And then in this study, the results were that ferritin transferrin saturation and TIBC, the p-value is not that significant. So they could not be correlated in differentiating non-anemic, anemic, and anemic bleeders compared to the control group.
Better than ferritin.
And chronic hepatitis B patient showed lower hepcidin levels when compared to this child A score. So the p-value is 0.02, which is significantly statistically significant.
Fine.
And these two, and when these individuals are grouped according to the ferritin levels, where ferritin is less than 100 or more than 100, they found out that everything is significant in these individuals. Even the iron values were found to be very significant. TIBC, transferrin saturation, and hepcidin levels are also significant. So the normal hemoglobin content of reticulocyte counts in adults is usually valued at 31.2 plus or minus 1.6 picograms per cell. So values which are less than 29 are usually categorized as functional iron deficiency. And iron deficiency anemia in chronic liver disease patients, it can occur either due to acute or chronic hemorrhage from the varix, or even vitamin deficiencies. And iron deficiency diagnosis is difficult since iron itself is regulated by the hepcidin and ferritin levels. And it was known that hepcidin is lower in patients with type B cirrhosis, and decreased.
Hepatitis C, you said, no?
B. Child Pug B compared to child Pug A, sir. The values were lower in child Pug B cirrhosis. And in the studies, they found that there is a significant positive correlation between the hepcidin levels and also the grades of hepatic inflammation in HCV patients. And the serum hepcidin is significantly lower in child A compared to that of child B groups in this study. Hence, this can be used as a marker for early hepatic insufficiency.
Child A and child B means hepatitis A and hepatitis B.
Nice, sir. Cirrhosis, sir.
Huh?
Liver disease in child B, liver disease, sir, based on child Pug scoring.
So this is classification of cirrhosis, sir. Parimal, you want to add to this? You want to just clarify? Miss Madam Deote, are you there?
Are you eating?
Yeah. Can you elaborate, ma'am?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, ma'am. Yeah.
You can hear me. Oh, yeah, I'm listening. There's no question. Very interesting.
Yeah. No, sir was asking about child classification, ma'am. All right, go on.
Yes, sir. Child Pug scoring is used to grade the cirrhosis. They have usually 5 parameters with which they'll grade the cirrhosis into child A, child B, and child C. In this study, child C has been excluded. So we are only taking into consideration of child A and child B. And among them, hepcidin was shown to be lower in child A group compared with child B group. And and there is no significant difference between the serum iron, TIBC, and ferritin, and the serum transferrin and transferrin saturation noted. And even erythrocyte parameters did not show significant difference among the studied groups. So now coming to the mechanism, the hepcidin, which is usually inhibited, usually increased in cases of interleukin 6, and even in cases of anemias, and it is negatively inhibited in cases of child child B cirrhosis. So the hepcidin usually acts near the duodenum, near ferroportin for iron absorption, and also acts near the reticuloendothelial system for iron metabolism, and acts near the liver for the release of iron from the reticuloendothelial system. So when this hepcidin is low, what happens is the iron cannot be circulated in the body. It gets trapped in the enterocytes in the intestine and also into the reticuloendothelial system. So this can lead to iron overload in those systems, but the serum iron levels may be normal. But the transferrin saturation, since the transferrin is also synthesized by the liver, so whenever there is liver failure, the transferrin will also be reduced. So in fact, the iron is reduced, transferrin is reduced. When both these are taken together, the transferrin saturation can be falsely normal or falsely high. So these could not be used in liver disease patients. So coming to this reticulocyte hemoglobin content is an early sign for iron-restricted erythropoiesis. This is used as a screening tool in identifying iron deficiency with or without anemia. The values less than 25 picograms per cell is usually considered as iron deficiency, and if it is less than 29, usually considered as functional iron deficiency. And this was shown to have a positive correlation with MCV, MCH in anemics and also non-anemic groups. And it has no correlation with hepcidin level. And since there is no significant...
is that if the hepcidin is low, you require to go more iron. Is that what you're saying?
No, sir. Hepcidin, in this study, they thought to see whether hepcidin and hemoglobin, reticulocyte hemoglobin levels will hold any correlation with the anemia in case of CHC patients. But in this study, it was shown that hepcidin has no positive correlation, but reticulocyte hemoglobin content showed a positive correlation with iron deficiency. So hepcidin can be used for assessment as an early marker for hepatic inflammation, and reticulocyte hemoglobin can be used to look for iron deficiency in chronic hepatitis C patients.
So hepcidin is a marker of liver disease.
Yes, sir. When the hepcidin levels are low, we can say that the diseased liver is more diseased. Like it is usually lower in child B scores compared to child A.
But this trial has nothing to do with the hepcidin levels in the diseased liver. It is not a trial of anything to do with hepcidin as a liver marker.
Yes, sir. And
anybody does hepcidin in? Anyone does hepcidin in Pune?
Hello.
I don't think, sir, anybody does hepcidin levels in Pune. I don't think Dr. Lavate is there because he would have been the best person to answer.
What about in anywhere in Maharashtra, Bombay?
I'm not sure.
So we had to send the sample to Australia actually.
Right. Yeah. All right. Who's next?
Sir, and there is no significant significant values of reticulocyte hemoglobin content and also erythrocyte and iron indices when compared in anemic bleeders and non-bleeders. So variceal bleeding, in fact, will not cause any iron deficiency in these patients. So the distribution of iron deficiency and serum iron overload should be done in all patients, regardless whether they are bleeders or non-bleeders. Study limitations are it is a small study and more and larger studies are required. So the take-home points are serum hepcidin can be used as a marker for early hepatic inflammation, and reticulocyte hemoglobin content is used for detection of iron deficiency in chronic hepatitis C patients, and variceal bleeding does not influence the iron status in chronic hepatitis C patients. Yes, sir.
Okay. Anything next?
No, sir. All for journals are over, sir, from our side.
Okay. Sir, would you like to add any information, anything, sir, to teach the students?
Pardon?
You want to add some information for the students, sir?
For this incident? No.
Anything. Just speak.
Is there anybody student wanting to speak? I have a thing on a simple thing. I mean, nothing very international. Have you heard of SUDEP? SUDEP?
No. No, sir.
No, sir.
Well, SUDEP stands for Sudden Unexplained Death in Epilepsy.
Unexpected death in epilepsy. Yeah.
Yeah. And its frequency is 1 in 600 for epileptic every year. That means 1 in 600 epileptics will develop SUDEP and die. And this may be changed to, if the person is in good control, 1 in 1,000. If the person is in moderate control, 1 in 500. And if the person is badly controlled, 1 in 100. That means severe epileptics more likely to get this condition. Now, what are the risk factors for SUDEP? Why do people get SUDEP? One is it is found in generalized tonic-clonic fits epilepsy. Second, the death is more common in sleep. Third, it is more common when the child is sleeping, person is sleeping alone with no one around. It is more common when he is not adhering to medicine, he is alcoholic so that he may fall anywhere, and he has got underlying cardiac disease. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Right. So the thing is, why does a person die? That is the question. And there are three mechanisms to consider. One is that it is cardiac in origin. Second is that it is pulmonary in origin. And the third, that it is cerebral in origin. So cardiac arrest means that every patient of epilepsy, especially those with severe epilepsy, should have a ECG, check for arrhythmia, check for LVH, check for cardiac dysfunction, and then this possibility has to be looked into. The second problem is that it might be due to a ventilatory failure. That was the person who spoke in the meeting in the fine. He said that he suspects that mostly it is ventilatory failure. The patient is lying in bed alone, and when he gets a fit, he might suffocate. He might not be breathing properly. And when the person's not breathing properly, if someone is around near him, they will push him, hey, what is it? What is the matter? What is the matter? And he might start breathing again. If there is no one around, he just quietly dies. The third problem, it might be a cerebral problem. And this is seen in patients when you do the EEG. When an EEG person gets a lot fits, gets a number of spikes one after the other. And then normally, after the burst of spikes is over, there is a slow activity starting in the brain. Some patients after this spike, they don't have slow activity, it goes flat for a long time and then may restart. So those people who have this flat EEG after an attack, they are likely to have a SUDEP. Additionally, there are some diseases in which SUDEP is particularly common. One is Dravet syndrome, which is seen in children with multiple fits. And some patients may have what is called near SUDEP. That means they almost go, but someone seems to come in the way. Someone sees them, and there might be some blueness of the face, blueness of the limbs, but he comes out. That is a near SUDEP. Now, interesting is that it is more common in generalized epilepsy. It doesn't occur in focal epilepsy. Now, when these people are so bad, the chances are that they will be considered for surgery. And when they are considered for surgery, the relations will ask, okay, what are the chances of surgery? And the surgeon will tell him, or at least the person who's sending him for surgery says that the surgery mortality is 1 in 1,000. But don't forget that your child is bad situation, and so he is likely to have 1 in 1,000 every year. So every year he lives, he has a chance of SUDEP, and that is equal to the mortality of the surgery. So that's one way at looking at it. Then, what about SUDEP in pregnancy? SUDEP is often increased in pregnancy. Why? Because the best drug for generalized epilepsy is valproate. And valproate is usually not given in epilepsy. And sometimes it happens that the person getting pregnant decides to reduce the medicine so that the child may not be harmed, and therefore may precipitate a fit. But actually, SUDEP is more common in males than females. I hope you're hearing well.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
Yes, sir.
Right. Coming to the end of it, one last point to make sure that the person is actually taking a drug. What do you think is the way to find out? Blood level or history? Interesting, I didn't know this. You have to take the person's hair. And yeah, and the drug remains in the hair depending on the duration of the hair. So every 1 centimeter will have this thing. So you can find that in the second month he didn't take, third month he took, fourth month he didn't take that, so that you can find out how he has been taking drugs for the last 6 months. Right. Simple. I have seen just one case of SUDEP, but it is an important problem, and 1 in 1,000 is all right, but epilepsy is quite a common disease, so it must be affecting quite a number of people. Any questions?
So what are the indications for surgery today in epilepsy?
The indication for surgery is when a person is not controlled by 3 or 4 drugs. You can go to 3 drugs and say what will happen. And it is found that if he doesn't control with 3, the chances to get control with the 4th and the 5th and the 6th are all 1%, 1%, 1%. This is, of course, assuming that the correct drug has been given. If the wrong drug is given, that's wrong. That is meaningless. But the correct drug is given. And about that pregnancy, what is the safest? The most unsafe drug is valproate. Safe just now is levetiracetam and lamotrigine.
So when we talk about surgery, are we talking about spontaneous epilepsy or even scar epilepsy? The same thing holds true?
As I said, that it is more common in generalized tonic-clonic seizures. So a scar epilepsy may show focal, but if it's a bad injury to the brain, it could be a generalized fit. So then whether scar or no scar, it will occur with generalized fit.
And is there a relationship of SUDEP with scar epilepsy, sir?
No, I'm not that I'm aware of.
Anybody, any questions, please go ahead. So I'd like to thank everybody. I think we've had a very wonderful session.